All he wanted was a quiet flight and a little legroom, but what he got was a quiet humiliation. Sergeant Thomas Ashton, a 78-year-old retired Marine with a service-connected knee injury, had planned every detail of his flight to Boston. He'd spent extra from his modest retirement savings to reserve aisle seat 15C in the economy comfort section, just enough space to stretch out his bad leg and endure the 5-hour trip. He wasn't asking for luxury, just dignity and the chance to arrive without pain. But minutes before takeoff, a flight attendant approached him with a request. A family had been split up by the booking system, and his seat was the only block of 3 available for them to sit together. Despite calmly explaining his medical need and prepaid reservation, he was offered only one alternative, seat 32B, a cramped middle seat in the back where his leg would have no space at all. No sympathy, no compromise, just a complimentary drink voucher and a growing line of impatient passengers watching it unfold. Tom knew the look. He was being made to feel like the problem. Not wanting to cause trouble, he finally stood, slowly, painfully, and gave up the seat he needed, his dignity left behind in 15C. As he shuffled toward the back of the plane, his heart ached more than his knee, not because of the inconvenience, but because of the quiet, everyday way respect can disappear when no one is watching. The seat may have changed, but the pain that followed was far deeper than the discomfort of a cramped cabin. As Sergeant Thomas Ashton took 32B, he was greeted not with understanding or compassion, but by silence. The flight attendant who had pressured him into moving, her tone growing firmer by the minute, offered no apology, no assistance. She had already turned her attention to other tasks, her problem now solved. But for Tom, the solution came at the cost of his dignity and comfort. Seated between a man spilling into his space and a young woman absorbed in her phone, Tom tried to make himself small, a difficult task for a man with a leg that hadn't bent right in 50 years. The aching in his knee began almost immediately. He shifted, adjusted, braced himself, but the pain was inescapable. Still, the physical discomfort wasn't the worst part. It was the way he had been treated, dismissed, spoken over, and ultimately devalued. In his decades of service, Tom had endured worse than a tight seat. But he'd always believed in respect, especially for those who served. He never expected to be elevated above others, but he did expect basic decency. Instead, he was made to feel like an obstacle, a complication in someone else's schedule. His carefully explained medical need had been brushed aside with a beverage coupon, as if that could replace consideration and common sense. He could feel the eyes of passengers as he passed down the aisle earlier, some curious, others indifferent. No one said anything. That silence hurt too. It wasn't just about him. It was about what it symbolized. That service, age, and sacrifice could be set aside the moment they became inconvenient. That kind of disregard leaves a mark deeper than shrapnel. Tom settled in as best he could. His carry-on, once neatly stowed, now jammed awkwardly at his feet. His shoulder brushed constantly by the man beside him, who barely acknowledged his presence. His breathing grew shallower as the discomfort intensified, yet he said nothing. The Marine in him had learned long ago to endure. But inside, something was unraveling, a deep, familiar frustration, a heavy sense of resignation. Then there was the helplessness. He had spoken up. He had asked for an alternative, even an upgrade, anything that wouldn't make him suffer. But when met with resistance, he did what so many veterans are conditioned to do. He complied quietly, and in that moment, he wasn't just moved to the back of the plane. He was pushed to the back of priority, of respect, of simple human decency. As the aircraft doors closed and the safety instructions played overhead, Tom closed his eyes, trying to breathe through the pain. The journey ahead would be long, and not just in miles. His granddaughter's graduation, once a bright and hopeful destination, now felt impossibly far away. He wasn't angry in the loud way. He wasn't going to cause a scene. That wasn't his style. But a deep ache had settled somewhere beyond his knee. The ache of being unseen, unheard, and forgotten. Little did he know, one passenger had been listening. And somewhere on the ground, or in the cockpit, someone else was about to take notice. Sometimes it only takes one person paying attention to change everything. As Sergeant Thomas Ashton sat stiffly in seat 32B, struggling to find even an inch of comfort, a man a few rows ahead adjusted his tie and reached quietly for his phone. He'd watched the entire situation unfold from his aisle seat in row 17. The polite veteran with the limp, the firm-voiced flight attendant, the awkward shuffle to the back of the plane. He hadn't planned on getting involved, but something about the way Tom had carried himself, the quiet dignity in his voice, the subtle humiliation he endured, stirred something in him. The man was Michael Grant, a senior executive in a defense contracting firm, traveling frequently for work. He was a Diamond Elite member of the airline's loyalty program, with access to high-tier support contacts that most passengers would never know existed. Michael knew how airline systems worked. He also knew what it looked like when someone was treated unfairly. He'd seen plenty of passengers raise a fuss over far less, an overhead bin dispute, a late beverage cart. But here was a man who'd served his country, forced into pain and silence, all for the convenience of others. And no one had lifted a finger. So he did. Opening a secure messaging app linked to his elite travel profile, Michael typed a message directly to Transcontinental Airlines' Priority Operations Center, a fast response desk that handled urgent service escalations. He kept it brief but clear. Flight 308, Gate C12, Marine veteran, late 70s, seat 15C, moved to 32B due to flight crew error, despite clear medical need. Service-connected injury, no alternative offered, treated dismissively. Passenger now visibly distressed. Request escalation and cockpit notification if possible. He hit send. Was he sure it would make a difference? No, but he felt he had to try. It was the least he could do. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about recognizing sacrifice, standing up for someone who no longer had the strength or the energy to stand up for himself. Michael tucked his phone back into his jacket pocket and looked toward the rear of the plane. He could just barely see Tom hunched in his seat, his shoulders slightly slumped, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. There was something about that posture, the quiet resolve, the familiar pain, that made Michael think of his own father, a Korean war vet who had passed a few years earlier. Minutes passed. The aircraft doors sealed. Safety announcements began. The plane pushed away from the gate. Tom had said nothing, done nothing disruptive. And yet, the weight of injustice hung thick in the cabin. Then, 9 minutes later, something unusual happened. The cockpit door cracked open. Even frequent flyers like Michael knew that wasn't typical. Not once the plane was moving. But there it was, the captain, in full uniform, stepping into the cabin with purpose in his stride and focus in his eyes. He paused, spoke briefly to a senior flight attendant, and then began walking toward the back, toward Tom. Michael felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't sure what was about to happen, but he had a feeling something important was in motion. He leaned back in his seat, silent but watchful, knowing that sometimes all it takes is one voice raised quietly at the right moment to set real respect back on course. When the cockpit door opened, the cabin fell silent. It's a rare sight, especially once a plane has left the gate and begun taxiing. But on Flight 308, 9 minutes after the doors were sealed, the atmosphere shifted. The passengers sensed something was different. From the front of the plane, Captain David Miller stepped into the aisle, tall and composed in his crisp Navy uniform, 4 gold stripes gleaming on his shoulders. A former Air Force pilot and a man known for his professionalism, Captain Miller didn't usually leave the cockpit unless absolutely necessary, but this moment was one of those rare exceptions. His gaze moved steadily through the cabin, eyes sweeping over the rows of passengers as he made his way down the narrow aisle. He stopped briefly to speak with the lead flight attendant, not the one who had displaced Tom, but a senior crew member who, with a quiet nod, gestured toward the rear of the aircraft. The captain nodded, his face unreadable. Then he continued walking, past rows of confused and curious passengers, past whispered speculations and craning necks, until he reached row 32. There sat Sergeant Thomas Ashton, shoulders hunched, eyes tired, wedged between 2 indifferent passengers. His pain was evident not just in his posture, but in the quiet resignation that radiated from him. Captain Miller paused in the aisle beside him, taking a moment to study the man who had been moved from his rightful seat. A long second passed, and then, in one swift, unmistakable gesture, Captain Miller stood tall and delivered a formal military salute, straight-backed, precise, and reverent. "Sergeant Thomas Ashton," the captain said, his voice cutting through the ambient hum of engines. "Sir, on behalf of Transcontinental Airlines and as a fellow veteran, please accept my sincere apology for the unacceptable way your seating situation has been handled today." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the cabin. Passengers who had watched Tom's silent suffering now saw him fully, not as a burden, but as a man who had served with honor. The bulky man beside him pulled back, offering space. The young woman beside him glanced up from her phone, suddenly aware. Captain Miller's expression shifted, respectful but firm. "I was alerted by our operations center and a concerned passenger who recognized a gross mistake. Forcing you from your medically necessary prepaid seat was not only inappropriate, it was a failure in our duty to respect those who've served this country." He turned slightly and addressed the cabin more broadly. "This will be corrected." Then, calling out across the rows, "Miss Susan!" The flight attendant who had moved Tom appeared, her face pale. The captain's gaze turned to ice. "Miss Susan, you will personally escort Sergeant Ashton to seat 1A in first class. If that seat is occupied, you will request a volunteer. If no one volunteers, you will inform the passenger currently seated there that the captain of this aircraft requires that seat for a Medal of Honor nominee who was shamefully mistreated." That detail wasn't entirely true. Tom hadn't received the Medal of Honor, but in that moment, it served its purpose. Susan nodded mutely. She offered no protest. Captain Miller looked back at Tom, his tone softening. "Sergeant Ashton, please allow us to begin making this right. You deserve more than an aisle seat. You deserve our gratitude." And with that, he extended a hand, not just in assistance, but in recognition. What began as a moment of quiet injustice turned into a public restoration of honor. As Captain Miller extended his hand, Sergeant Thomas Ashton hesitated for only a moment, startled by the unfolding scene. He had expected nothing more than discomfort for the next 5 hours. Instead, he was now the center of an extraordinary act of respect. Passengers in the nearby rows sat frozen, watching as Tom slowly rose from the cramped middle seat in 32B, aided gently by the captain himself. The pain in his knee was still sharp, but something else was rising in him too. A flicker of dignity, long buried beneath years of silence and sacrifice. With flight attendant Susan walking stiffly ahead, her expression now one of embarrassment and reluctant humility, Tom was guided forward, back down the same aisle he had limped through just minutes before, but this time with heads turning not in pity or annoyance, but in recognition. Several passengers murmured, "Thank you for your service." Others offered quiet nods, some averting their eyes in shame at having remained silent earlier. When they reached first class, with Tom sank into the wide, comfortable seat with a grateful sigh, his leg finally allowed to stretch freely, his pain slowly easing. A warm towel, a pre-departure beverage, and a personal apology from the lead flight attendant followed. But even more comforting than the luxuries was the presence of Captain Miller, who returned briefly before the plane took off. "Again, Sergeant," the captain said quietly, crouching beside his seat. "I apologize for what happened. It never should have. You were treated like an inconvenience when you should have been treated like an honored guest, and I want you to know this airline will do better." Tom looked the captain in the eye, emotions stirred but steady. "Thank you, Captain," he said, "not just for the seat, but for remembering." The flight that had begun with frustration now soared with newfound warmth. Passengers, moved by what they had witnessed, behaved differently, more courteous, more quiet, more reflective. The captain's words over the intercom had made it clear. This wasn't just about correcting a mistake. It was about sending a message. That service still mattered, leadership wasn't about rank, but responsibility. When the flight landed in Boston, Tom was greeted at the gate by a Transcontinental Airlines Special Services agent who apologized again and handed him paperwork for a full refund and a voucher for future first-class travel for both himself and his granddaughter. The airline had already launched a review of its veteran accommodation policies. The response wasn't just reactive, it was meaningful. Later that weekend, as Tom sat proudly in the audience at his granddaughter's graduation, pain-free and well-rested, he reflected not on the seat he had lost, but on the moment he was seen again. Not for his age or limp, but for his service, his sacrifice, and his quiet strength. Sometimes all it takes is one voice to speak up and one leader to stand tall. Even at 30,000 feet, character can rise higher than altitude. Sergeant Thomas Ashton's journey was more than a flight from Arizona to Boston. It became a powerful reminder that dignity can still take flight, even after years of being grounded by silence. What began as a quiet dismissal of a veteran's needs ended with an airline captain, a fellow serviceman, standing tall to restore what bureaucracy had brushed aside: respect. In a world often too hurried to notice quiet suffering, this story reminds us that one act of courage, a message from a passenger, a step from the cockpit, can shift the entire course of a moment, a memory, a man's day. Tom's pain wasn't just physical, it was the ache of being forgotten. But when someone finally said, "We see you," it echoed louder than any announcement. That moment didn't just correct a mistake, it restored honor. Life lesson. In a world that often prioritizes efficiency over empathy, we must never forget that the quietest souls often carry the heaviest burdens. A kind word, a simple stand, or even a small act of acknowledgement can restore more than comfort. It can restore someone's faith in humanity. Veterans don't ask for special treatment. They ask to be remembered. Let's be the kind of people who don't wait for a uniform to show respect. If this story moved you, comment, "I stand with our veterans." Share your thoughts below. Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone stood up for what was right? Subscribe to this channel for more powerful true stories that remind us who we are when we choose to care. Because dignity should never be downgraded.